and I lead the Governance for Equitable Growth program at the North-South Institute. I'll only be speaking for about 10 minutes, and I'll take care not to be more than that, so you have an idea of how long I'll be speaking for. I am not going to Rio, and I think I should say that up front. But as Julia said, my interest in the Rio+20 process is really how it fits into the global politics of development and how it fits into, say, what might happen in the post-2015 framework. So that's my entry point into how I'm analysing and thinking about these issues. And so that will give you an idea of my frame of reference. So just to provide some context, as I'm the person kicking this off today. I mean, from my perspective and my analysis, a lot of this sort of stuff started in 1972 with a conference on human environment. That was followed up by the Brundtland Commission in 1987, publishing Our Common Future. And then, of course, the first Rio conference in 1992, which was attended by over 100 heads of state, government, representatives from 178 countries, just under 20,000 participants. And one analyst, a journalist I just read recently, had a very, I think, fitting quote where he said, back in 1992, more than 100 world leaders, including George H.W. Bush, showed up to the Rio Summit in Rio de Janeiro. It was a 2-week mega event that attracted huge attention, highlighted by the signing of 2 groundbreaking treaties on climate change and biodiversity and grand declarations about creating a future, green and equitable world. So kind of my reading of this is that 1992 was a hugely exciting conference and a huge event in the global politics of the environment and development. There was Agenda 22, which was published. There was a real recognition of the 3 pillars of sustainable development, being the environment, the economy, and society. So that's that kind of context from which we're building on. From my perspective, these conferences were very much fit within the sustainable development sort of pillar of things. They fit squarely in sustainable development and how we think about sustainable development. But my reading and my analysis of what kind of has happened is that we then, in the 1990s and 2000s, had a kind of breaking between the environment on the one hand and international development on the other. So while we started in 1992 thinking about sustainable development and a lot of these things collectively and kind of intrinsically interlinked, we then in the 1990s and 2000s had this break between the environment and development. And I think even within those 2 different areas, we had, on the environment side, on the one hand, a lot of very exciting agreements and multilateral decisions around conservation, and then, of course, climate change and Kyoto and the Conference of the Parties process. On the development side, we had the Millennium Development Goals, which had a very strong poverty focus. We had poverty reduction strategy papers, which had a very strong poverty focus. We had a kind of another agenda around aid effectiveness and financing for development. And then I guess early in the 2000s, we had a bit of a pushback from southern governments who were saying we need to have more of a focus on economic growth. So some of my analysis and some of my thinking and others' thinking on this is that maybe the Rio conference that's happening in 2 weeks might be a re-merging of the environment and development agendas. And I guess we'll have to see how that works, but I think there are a number of reasons why that might be the case. And I think that there are essentially 3 reasons why we can see that maybe Rio+20 represents a coming back together of the environment and the development agendas. I think firstly, environment issues, climate change, but also energy, water and biodiversity are increasingly impinging on development. And this is, I think, many would argue, has always been the case, but from an international development perspective, I think there's a real recognition that issues of sustainability in the environment are really, really incredibly central and will be to the post-MDG framework. I think the second reason why there could be this merging and coming together at Rio+20 is that there is some thinking going on in the international development community around what will happen post-2015. And I think the MDGs did not have a strong sustainability or environment focus. And I would argue what happens in the post-2015 agenda will have a much, much stronger sustainability and environment focus. I think thirdly, the kind of the kind of third reason why there could be this real merging back of the environment and development agendas is that 2015 represents a very important year for climate change around the Durban platform on the one hand, but also for the MDGs and what will happen in the post 2015 kind of global development poverty reduction framework. So that kind of provides a context in my entry point or analysis, and I think it's quite useful to think about those kind of broader framing issues as we start this discussion.
Oh, sorry. No? Wait. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. So when we come to Rio and Rio+20 and thinking about what the priorities are, I mean, I think they're essentially in the draft outcome documents and all of the kind of subsequent negotiating text that we're all following. There are essentially four areas. The first is that Rio+20, there'll be a renewal of political commitment to sustainable development. The second area is around green economy, which I think Pat will talk about in more detail. The third is around institutional frameworks to develop for sustainable development. And the fourth is the framework for action or what the commitments are going to be. And I think there are some general themes that are coming out in the negotiations, but I think Pat and Farid are probably much better positioned to speak about this. But I mean, it is a negotiating process. We have the typical kind of negotiation and compromise going on. On the green economy, which we're focusing on today, we have some OECD countries that are pushing quite hard on the green economy agenda. We then have the G77 plus China saying that we think that we should be able to kind of carve out our own kind of sustainable development agenda. We're not prepared to commit to a green economy in the way that OECD countries are trying to push. So I think there are some interesting negotiations going on around that. I think that there is a concern from the G77 plus China around the poverty focus of some of this, and they're keen to not lose a strong poverty focus in the Rio+20 negotiations. Of course, we have the Rio principle of common but differentiated responsibility coming up a lot, and that is going to be a key issue in deciding what the sustainable development goals are, which I'll discuss in a moment, and the post-MDG framework will look like. And then around the institutional framework for development, we have a whole lot of discussions about whether UNEP should be upgraded, whether there should be a global environment or a world environment organization that is maybe similar to the World Trade Organization. But my reading on this so far is that the global politics with the EU in the position that it's in, and also the US government in an election year, that there probably won't be a whole lot of movement or traction on that. So just to conclude, I just want to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, because I think this is quite important for a couple of reasons. One of the main reasons is that this is the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, which are goals that governments would commit to at Rio+20 or would start a process of committing to at Rio+20, is being coined or is being seen as one of the potential tangible wins or tangible concrete outcomes out of Rio+20. I think a number of people would kind of criticize the potential focus on the SDGs, and people would say that this focus on the SDGs is maybe is kind of making us lose track or lose sight of other important issues on the green economy that will be discussed at Rio+20. But this is where people are putting some effort and people are putting some faith, I think, as some tangible outcome from Rio+20. And I think it's important that we understand what they might mean or what they might be. Some governments are pushing for a real agreement on sustainable development goals at Rio+20. And by that I mean some very specific ideas about what sustainable development goals might be. So, for example, they want agreement on specific goals around, say, oceans or around energy at Rio+20. Others are saying, including the US government, that let's just start the process, or let's just decide how we're going to decide what the sustainable development goals are. Now, what's very important to kind of think about and realize in this process is that we have the Rio+20 process and this push to decide sustainable development goals, which are global goals that member states commit to. We also have a parallel process going on, which is that the UN Secretary General has appointed a high-level panel on the Millennium Development Goals and the Post-Millennium Development Goal framework. So what I am arguing, and what a number of people are arguing, is that these cannot be parallel processes. Having sustainable development goals and post-2015 goals is not going to work. And maybe one of the real concrete outcomes from Rio+20 might be that there is some sort of process established for how these two parallel systems or parallel processes are going to work together. Just to conclude, I think there are three issues that will be interesting to follow on the Sustainable Development Goals. The first is, who will the Sustainable Development Goals cover? The Millennium Development Goals were essentially focused on low and middle income countries, and the OECD countries had to commit to providing aid and doing some things around technology transfer, free trade, financial systems. Will the Sustainable Development Goals require actually much more substantive domestic policy change from OECD countries? I think that's a big question. So who will they actually cover? The second will be, what will the issues be? And I think when we think about this, the question is, will they really be environmental or sustainability sort of goals, or will they be goals that actually really bridge the human development and the sustainability nexus? And then I think the third issue, and I think this is where there will be some decision and some traction at Rio, is what will be the process for deciding what these goals are, and how will this process work in the post-2015 framework. So I think just to conclude, I think Rio+20 will be interesting and exciting for us to follow. I think a lot of us feel like we won't get out of Rio+20 what we would like, and I think it could be a potential real missed opportunity. I have a paper coming out next week that provides some analysis around these issues in a lot more detail. And next week at NSI, we're also launching a initiative called International Development in a Changing World. And our following of the Rio+20 process will be a very key part of this. So if anyone is wanting to engage on this, please do through the Canadian International Development Platform, and you can see that